Please, help me. They're beating my mama. They won't stop hitting her.
Please help me. They're beating my mama. They won't stop hitting. Her pink lace dress was trembling as she gripped the stranger's heavy, tattooed arm. The colorful beads in her braids clicked together as she looked up, her voice cracking with pure terror. The music in the VIP lounge cut instantly. Expensive wine glasses froze in midair. Every hardened criminal in the room held their breath. But the man she had chosen to interrupt wasn't just a businessman. He was Lee Tae-min, the emperor of the Korean syndicate, and a man who hadn't shown mercy or a smile in 5 years. And what the emperor did next didn't just break the rules of the underworld. It left everyone witnessing it absolutely speechless. You need to stay until the end, because the transformation of this cold-hearted monster will shock you to the core. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe button to subscribe to this channel and comment below where you're watching from, so I can specially send you a regard. Now, let's step into the heart of the story. The bass of the music downstairs was just a distant tremor in the floorboards, a rhythmic reminder of the chaos Lee Tae-min controlled but never partook in. Up here, in the glass-walled sanctuary of the Sapphire Club's VIP lounge, silence was the ultimate luxury. It was a cold, expensive silence that cost more than the bottles of vintage Bordeaux resting on the black marble tables. At the center of the room sat Tae-min, the man the streets whispered about as the Emperor. He didn't look like a man who worried about police raids or rival territories. He looked like a statue carved from ice and regret. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the intricate scales of a black dragon tattoo that coiled up his chest and disappeared along his neck, a permanent mark of the syndicate he ruled with an iron fist. Gold rings glinted under the dim recessed lighting as he swirled his wine, his dark eyes fixed on nothing in particular, yet missing absolutely nothing. To the men and women in sharp business suits sitting around him, Tae-min was a force of nature to be feared. He was the architect of the city's underworld, a man who had consolidated power through calculated ruthlessness. They knew the stories. They knew that 5 years ago, Tae-min had been different, a man who laughed, who had a family. But that man died the same day his daughter did. The Lee Tae-min who remained was a ghost in a Gucci suit, a man who had surgically removed his own heart to ensure it could never be broken again. Tonight was business as usual, the weekly briefing. His lieutenants spoke in hushed, reverent tones, outlining profits and territories. Tae-min listened without expression, his face a perfect mask of indifference. He didn't need to shout to command attention. His silence was heavy enough to crush a man's confidence. In this room, you didn't speak unless spoken to, and you certainly didn't bring up the past. Sentiment in Tae-min's world was a liability. It was the crack in the armor, where the knife always found its way in. The air in the lounge was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Every person at the table was walking on eggshells, terrified of triggering the dragon. They thought they understood the rules of this world: power, fear, and absolute control. They thought tonight would end like every other Tuesday night, with deals struck and enemies silenced. But the universe has a way of laughing at the plans of powerful men, and the fortress Tae-min had built to keep the world out was about to be breached by the one thing he couldn't defend against. The double doors at the entrance of the lounge didn't just open. They flew back against the bumpers with a violence that made 3 lieutenants instinctively reach for the guns holstered inside their tailored jackets. Security at the Sapphire Club was supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress of muscle and metal detectors designed to keep threats out. But the intruder that stumbled into the room wasn't a rival hit squad or a police raid. It was a blur of bright, frantic pink. A little girl, no older than 7, skidded across the polished marble floor. Her chest was heaving, her small black patent leather shoes slipping slightly as she scrambled for footing. She looked like she had been dropped from another planet, one of playgrounds and sunshine, straight into this dark, smoke-filled purgatory. Her pink lace dress was torn at the hem, and her beaded braids swung wildly around a face slick with sweat and tears. "Hey, stop!" A bodyguard bellowed, his massive frame lunging to intercept her. But fear is a powerful fuel. She ducked under his grasping hand with a desperate agility, her movements erratic and fueled by pure panic. She wasn't looking for an exit. She was scanning the room, her wide, terrified eyes searching for a savior among the wolves. The patrons sat frozen, their conversations severed mid-sentence, watching in stunned disbelief as this child wove through the maze of tables. Most children would have recoiled at the sight of Lee T-Min, the dark ink spiraling up his neck, the cold indifference in his eyes, and the sheer terrifying stillness of him usually made grown men look away. But this child didn't flinch. Perhaps instinct told her that the man at the center of the storm was the only one with the power to stop the rain. She didn't run from him, she ran straight to him. The room went dead silent. The ambient hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed deafening. The little girl crashed into the side of T-Min's chair, her momentum nearly knocking the wind out of her. Her hands, tiny and trembling, clamped onto T-Min's forearm. Her fingers dug into the ink of the dragon on his skin, gripping his flesh as if it were the only solid thing left in her world. She gasped for air, a sob tearing through her throat that sounded far too heavy for her small body. "Please," she cried out, her voice cracking and echoing off the glass walls. "You have to help. They're beating my mama. They won't stop." The silence in the room was shattered by the heavy tread of the head of security, a brute named Marcus, who rushed forward with a scowl etched into his face. In T-Min's world, unauthorized contact was a death sentence, and a stranger touching the Emperor was a failure of the highest order. Marcus reached out, his massive hand closing around the girl's shoulder to yank her away. "Get off him," Marcus snarled, his voice low and dangerous. But T-Min didn't shake the child off. He didn't even blink. He was frozen, his gaze locked onto the small, trembling girl clinging to his arm. The warmth of her hand burned against his skin, a shocking contrast to the cold void he had lived in for 5 years. He looked down at her, really looked at her, and for a terrifying second the VIP lounge dissolved. He didn't see a stranger, he saw a ghost. The pink lace of her dress blurred into the memory of a similar dress, one he had bought for a birthday party that never happened. The terror in Jada's wide, dark eyes mirrored the nightmare that replayed behind his eyelids every time he tried to sleep. It was the same look of absolute helplessness, the same plea for safety from a world too cruel for something so small. His daughter, Minjai, would have been this age now. She would have had braids like this. She would have looked at him with this same desperate trust. The ice that encased Lee T-Min's heart didn't melt. It cracked with the force of a gunshot. "Boss, I'll handle this," Marcus said, tightening his grip on Jada's shoulder. The little girl let out a sharp cry of pain, shrinking away from the guard. That sound was the catalyst. T-Min's hand shot out, grabbing Marcus's wrist with a speed and force that made the large man gasp. The grip was iron, punishing, and absolute. "Let her go," T-Min said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a violence that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. Marcus released her instantly, stepping back with wide eyes. "Boss." T-Min ignored him. He turned his attention back to Jada. He slowly lowered himself from his chair, crouching down until he was eye level with her. The movement was fluid, but heavy with purpose. The terrifying emperor of the underworld was kneeling on the floor of a nightclub, oblivious to the shocked stares of his lieutenants. He reached out, his tattooed fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "You said they are hurting your mother," he stated, his voice devoid of its usual chill. "Where?" Jada sniffled, pointing a shaking finger toward the exit, toward the harsh reality of the streets outside. "The shop. The bad men with the red bandanas, please." T-Min stood up. The decision had been made in the space of a heartbeat. He buttoned his suit jacket, his face hardening into a mask of deadly resolve. The grief was still there, but now it had a target. "Get the cars," he commanded, walking toward the door without looking back. "And bring the doctor." The city streets became a blur of neon streaks and rain-slicked asphalt as the convoy tore through the district. 3 armored black sedans moved in a tight, aggressive formation, parting the late-night traffic like the prow of an icebreaker. They ignored red lights and speed limits, the laws of the road dissolving in the face of the Emperor's urgency. Inside the lead vehicle, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Jada sat perched on the edge of the hand-stitched leather seat, her feet barely touching the plush floor mats. She looked incredibly small against the vast, dark interior of the luxury car, her pink dress a stark anomaly in a world of charcoal suits and gunmetal. She was trembling, her hands gripping the seatbelt strap across her chest as the car took a sharp corner, the tires groaning against the pavement. Beside her, Lee T-Min was a statue of controlled violence. He hadn't spoken since they left the club, but the air around him crackled with a terrifying energy. He was staring out the tinted window, his jaw set so hard a muscle feathered near his ear. He wasn't looking at the passing buildings. He was running calculations, visualizing the layout of the streets, and preparing for the violence that was required of him. The unbuttoned collar of his shirt revealed the dragon on his chest, which seemed to rise and fall with his slow, deep breaths. Jada stole a glance at him, her eyes wide and wet. To the rest of the world, he was a monster, a man who commanded fear with a mere lift of his brow. But to her, in the quiet hum of the speeding car, he was the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. She sniffled, the sound small and pathetic in the heavy silence. T-Min's gaze shifted. He didn't turn his head fully, but his eyes slid toward her. He saw the way her beaded braids shook with every vibration of the engine. He saw the bruise forming on her small wrist where she had likely been grabbed. The sight of it made his blood run cold, colder than it had been in years. It wasn't the detached coldness of business. It was the icy, razor-sharp focus of a predator protecting its own. "We are close," T-Min said, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't a comfort exactly, but a statement of fact, a promise. He reached into the pocket of the door and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. Without looking at her, he offered it. Jada hesitated for a second, then took it with shaking fingers, wiping her nose. "Driver," T-Min commanded, his tone leaving no room for failure. "Faster." The engine roared in response, the G-force pushing them back into their seats as the convoy accelerated toward the chaos waiting for them. The dragon was awake, and he was bringing a storm with him. The convoy didn't park. It occupied the street. The 3 black sedans screeched to a halt in front of Keisha's Braiding and Boutique, effectively blocking the narrow road and casting long, menacing shadows over the cracked sidewalk. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from people knowing better than to look out their windows when trouble comes knocking. But the salon itself was a cacophony of destruction. Through the large front window, which was already spiderwebbed with cracks, the violence was playing out in high definition. Inside, the air was thick with the chemical tang of spilled hair products and the sharp scent of fear. Chairs were overturned. Mirrors were shattered, shards of glass glinting on the linoleum like diamonds in the dust. Jada lunged for the door handle. A desperate cry caught in her throat, but T-Min's hand shot out, clamping onto her shoulder. It wasn't rough, but it was immovable. "Stay," he ordered. His voice was low, vibrating with a command that bypassed the brain and went straight to the instinct. "Do not move until I say." Jada froze, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her small hands against the tinted glass. Inside, her mother, Keisha, was on her knees amidst the wreckage. She was a beautiful woman, her face strong but currently twisted in terror. Standing over her was a man in a frayed denim vest, Snake. He held a metal baseball bat loosely in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He was shouting, his spit flying as he gestured to the empty register. T-Min watched the scene with a terrifying clarity. He saw Snake grab a handful of Keisha's hair, jerking her head back to force her to look at him. He saw the way Keisha flinched, not for herself, but glancing toward the back room where she had hidden her daughter, unaware Jada had already escaped. That look, that desperate, sacrificial maternal instinct, hit T-Min like a physical blow. It was the same look his wife had given him moments before the end. The memory didn't bring sadness this time, it brought fire. A shift occurred in the backseat of the luxury sedan. The air pressure seemed to drop. The calculated, business-minded emperor who worried about profit margins and police treaties vanished. In his place, something ancient and violent began to uncoil. The dragon on his chest seemed to burn against his skin. T-Min unbuckled his seatbelt. The sound was a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet car. He didn't check for his weapon. He didn't need one. He smoothed the front of his unbuttoned white shirt, his eyes never leaving the man with the bat. "Watch," he whispered to Jada, his voice devoid of any human warmth. He opened the car door and stepped out into the night. The sleeping dragon had woken up, and it was hungry. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, welcoming sound that seemed grotesquely out of place as Lee T-Min stepped into the salon. The sound cut through the shouting like a razor, causing the 5 gang members to freeze. Snake, the leader, turned slowly, the metal baseball bat resting lazily on his shoulder. He looked T-Min up and down, taking in the expensive white shirt and the gold watch, and sneered. "Lost, rich boy," Snake taunted, spitting on the floor near Keisha trembling legs. "Appointments only." T-Min didn't speak. He didn't even blink. He simply reached behind him and turned the deadbolt on the glass door. The loud click echoed in the small room, final and absolute. It wasn't to keep them out, it was to lock them in. Outside, the massive bodyguard who had driven the lead car stepped directly in front of Jada window. Jada tried to peer around him, her small hands pressing against the glass, but the man's broad suit jacket became a wall of black wool. "Eyes on me, little one," he said through the glass, his voice muffled but firm. "This part isn't for you." Inside, the violence exploded with terrifying speed. One of Snake's lackeys lunged first, pulling a switchblade. T-Min didn't retreat. He stepped into the space, his movement a blur of kinetic energy. He caught the man's wrist, twisting it with a sickening crack that dropped the attacker to his knees, before delivering a precise, devastating kick to the chest that sent him flying into a styling chair. The room erupted. Snake swung the bat, aiming for T-Min's head. T-Min ducked under the arc of the weapon with the grace of a dancer, the wind of the swing ruffling his hair. He rose and drove his elbow into Snake's ribs, the impact sounding like a gunshot. Snake gasped, dropping the bat as the air left his lungs, but T-Min wasn't finished. This was no longer business. This was personal. He moved through the remaining men like water, fluid and unstoppable. He slammed one face first into a mirror, the glass shattering into 1,000 diamonds around them. Another tried to run, but T-Min caught him by the collar, hurling him effortlessly over the shampoo station. It was unbuttoned fury, raw, visceral, and efficient. There was no wasted movement, only the brutal dismantling of bullies who had forgotten their place in the food chain. Within 30 seconds, the salon was silent again, save for the groans of broken men writhing on the floor. Snake lay gasping at T-Min's feet, blood bubbling from his nose. T-Min stood over him, his chest heaving slightly, the dragon tattoo on his chest now slick with sweat. He adjusted his cuffs, his expression returning to that mask of cold indifference, though his eyes burned with a lingering fire. He looked down at Keisha, who was staring up at him in shock, realizing that the monster she feared had just eaten the wolves. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the noise. The only sounds in the wrecked salon were the jagged breaths of the unconscious men on the floor and the soft, terrified weeping of Keisha. Lee T-Min didn't look at the bodies he had dismantled. To him, they were no longer threats. They were refuse, obstacles that had been removed with necessary prejudice. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone, his knuckles slightly bruised but his hand steady. He didn't dial 911. The police asked questions, T-Min dealt in solutions. He pressed a single speed dial number. Dr. Choi, T-Min said, his voice flat and devoid of adrenaline. I have a code white at the corner of 4th and Main. Trauma kit. 2 minutes. He hung up before an answer could be given. Keisha was pressing a towel to a cut on her forehead, staring at him with wide, trembling eyes. She looked from the tattooed dragon on his chest to the heap of groaning gang members. Who are you? She stammered, shrinking back as he stepped toward her. T-Min stopped, giving her space. He buttoned his cuffs, hiding the ink, effectively putting the monster back in its cage. I am the man your daughter found, he said simply. Before Keisha could process this, the front door rattled. The massive bodyguard outside unlocked it, and a blur of pink rushed in. Mama. Jada hit her mother's chest like a collision, burying her face in Keisha Wrightquote's neck. The woman crumpled, wrapping her arms around her child, rocking back and forth in the broken glass. T-Min watched them, his expression unreadable, though a phantom ache throbbed in his chest. It was a scene he had played out in his dreams 1,000 times, a reunion he never got to have. Less than 90 seconds later, the street outside was bathed in the white glow of headlights. A matte black van, unmarked and sleek, screeched to a halt behind T-Min Wrightquote's convoy. The side doors slid open, and 4 men in dark tactical scrubs poured out. They didn't look like paramedics. They looked like a special ops team armed with stethoscopes. They swept into the salon with practiced efficiency. No sirens, no radio chatter. 2 of them moved the unconscious gang members into a pile in the corner to clear the floor, while Dr. Choi, a sharp-eyed man with graying temples, knelt beside Keisha. Mr. Lee, the doctor nodded once at his boss before turning his attention to the woman. He opened a metallic case that looked more military than medical. Ma'am, I need you to look at this light. We're going to take care of that cut. You're in the best hands in the city. Keisha looked around, bewildered. She saw the expensive equipment, the respectful efficiency of the team, and the way everyone deferred to the silent man in the white shirt standing by the window. This wasn't emergency care. This was the kind of service reserved for presidents and kings. T-Min turned his back on the room, staring out at the dark street. He had brought violence to save them, but it was his resources, the empire he had built on blood, that would heal them. For the first time in 5 years, the power he wielded felt like something other than a burden. The Midnight Garage was less a mechanic shop and more a graveyard for stolen parts, a concrete box on the edge of the district where the street gang counted their crumpled bills. It was a place that smelled of oil and arrogance, a sanctuary for men who thought they owned the night. That illusion shattered the moment the steel bay door groaned upward, revealing Lee T-Min standing in the floodlight like a judgment from above. He didn't bring an army this time. He brought only 2 men and a distinct, terrifying calm. Inside, the gang's upper management, a man named Kingston and 3 of his lieutenants, scrambled from their poker table, hands drifting toward waistbands. But they stopped when they saw Snake, their best enforcer, dumped unceremoniously onto the concrete floor at their feet, battered and barely conscious. We can handle this like businessmen, Kingston stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating under T-Min's dead-eyed stare. Whatever that girl's mom owes you, we can double it. Cash. T-Min ignored him. He walked to the greasy workbench, cleared a space among the spark plugs, and placed a pristine, leather-bound notebook on the surface. He clicked a gold pen, the sound echoing in the silent garage. Medical bills for trauma and lacerations, 15,000, T-Min said, his voice soft, almost bored. He wrote the figure down in elegant script. Structural damage to commercial property, 8,000. Loss of business revenue, 5,000. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Kingston. Emotional distress to a minor, incalculable. but let's call it 50,000 for the inconvenience. Kingston blinked, sweating. So, 78 grand. I don't have that kind of cash on hand, man, but give me a weekend. I don't want your money, T-Min interrupted, closing the notebook with a snap. Money is easy. Money you can steal. I want something more valuable. I want your time. T-Min stepped closer, the dragon tattoo peeking from his collar seeming to breathe with him. Starting tomorrow at dawn, your men will return to the salon. You will sweep the glass. You will paint the walls. You will install new fixtures. And you will do it while wearing uniforms I provide, under the supervision of my guards. Kingston laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. You want us to play janitor. We run these streets. You ran these streets, T-Min corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. He reached out and adjusted Kingston's collar, a gesture that was intimate and terrifying. Now you work for the neighborhood you tried to break. If a single paintbrush is out of place, or if I hear that one of your men even looked at that little girl wrong, the debt will be paid in blood instead of labor. He turned and walked away, leaving the notebook on the bench. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a sentence. The Emperor had spoken, and the wolves were now his workhorses. 3 months later, the bell above the door of Keisha's Crown and Glory chimed, but this time, the sound wasn't a warning. It was a melody in a symphony of laughter, blow dryers, and gossip. The jagged scar of the broken window had been replaced by pristine, reinforced glass that gleamed under the afternoon sun. The smell of fear and spilled chemicals was gone, replaced by the warm, sweet scents of shea butter and vanilla. The salon was packed. Women filled every chair, their conversations creating a vibrant hum of life that spilled out onto the sidewalk. But the moment the tall, broad-shouldered man in the charcoal suit stepped through the door, a hush fell over the room. It wasn't the terrified silence of the past, however. It was a respectful pause. The neighborhood knew who paid for the renovations. They knew whose shadow kept the streets safe at night. Lee T-Min removed his sunglasses, his eyes sweeping the room not for threats, but for familiar faces. He still carried himself with the dangerous grace of a jungle cat, the dragon tattoo hidden beneath a crisp Oxford shirt, but the tension in his jaw had loosened. "You're late, Mr. Lee," a small voice chirped from the back. Jada stood by the drying station, hands on her hips, looking every bit the manager she pretended to be. She wore a new dress, bright yellow like a daffodil, and her braids were fresh and intricate. Keisha looked up from a client, smiling, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Don't mind her," she laughed. "She's been checking the clock since noon." T-Min didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched, a microscopic crack in the marble facade. He walked over to the empty styling chair Jada was patting emphatically. To the shock of the new customers, the terrifying emperor of the underworld sat down obediently, his massive frame looking almost comical in the salon chair. "My hair is fine," T-Min stated, his voice a low rumble. "It's boring," Jada corrected, climbing onto the stool behind him. "It needs flavor." For the next 10 minutes, the most dangerous man in the city sat perfectly still, while a 7-year-old girl combed through his slicked-back hair. His bodyguards, standing outside by the black sedan, watched through the window with bewildered expressions, but they knew better than to intervene. "Done," Jada announced triumphantly. T-Min leaned forward to look in the mirror. Staring back at him was the same hard face that had ordered hits and dismantled gangs. But there, right above his right ear, clipped firmly into his dark hair, was a bright, neon-pink butterfly barrette. It was ridiculous. It was undignified. It was completely contrary to everything the Emperor stood for. T-Min looked at the reflection of the little girl beaming behind him. He touched the plastic butterfly gently, as if it were made of glass. For the first time in 5 years, the ghost in his eyes faded, replaced by something warm and alive. "It is acceptable," he said, solemnity. As Jada giggled and hugged his neck, Lee Tiemann realized he hadn't just saved a salon. In the process of fixing their broken world, they had managed to fix him too. The end. If you love this story, kindly subscribe to this channel and leave a like for us.